I made a VR game. It's not a full game, obviously. I made it for 7-Day FPS, a game jam hosted on itch.io. It was hosted for about a week between December 8th and 17th, although it has been extended to the end of the month and is likely over by the time this video gets put up. I took part in this jam last year, where I made a zombie game where all the weapons you had were shotguns, and it was bad, so this time around I wanted to make something a little better. I went over the idea for this game in the last video, but I'll go over it again. I wanted to make a VR shooter that spawned enemies in time with the music, similar to Pistol Whip, but with the user's own music files. Additionally, I wanted Half-Life Alyx's gun mechanics, as I prefer having mechanical control as opposed to putting the guns by my side to reload them like Pistol Whip. And so we have this year's game, End of the Line, which is not the best title I could have come up with, but it's the title I used for the Unity project, so I'm sticking with it. Let's move on to some of the implementation, starting with the path the player is on. After playing a bunch of Pistol Whip and wondering why it never made me motion sick, I started thinking that taking movement away from the player and automating it, and letting them focus on combat instead might be a solution to the motion sickness problem. So to start, I created a spline and moved the player along it using Spline Animate. I started off with a straight line and thought it worked quite well. Then I made a couple of extra knots in the spline for turns. This triggered my motion sickness. This happened for 3 reasons. Turns weren't straight, they were made using Bezier curves. The spline animate was forcing the player's rotation to match the spline, causing uncontrolled movement. And finally, due to an error on my part, the spline arched upwards on one of the turns, which felt really awful. Following that experience, I ditched the Bezier curves in favour of straight line paths with hard 90-degree turns. I kept it flat, and I also stopped spline animate from changing the rotation of the player. After that, no issues. What then followed was creating the spline based on the audio track. My solution for it was to generate the spline in a number of segments, between 3 and 10 segments for the whole song. These segments were of equal length, divided down from the total length, which in turn was originally calculated by the speed I want the player to move at, multiplied by the time duration of the song. When spawning each segment, I set a direction which was one of the 3 directions from the last knot of the spline, those being forward, left or right. The code for it is a mess, but it does work. After that, I wanted to spawn some buildings to the left and right of the player. Originally I thought I could do this with Spline Instantiate, but I very quickly realized that it doesn't spawn anything at runtime, it's only for editor use. The spline doesn't have any points on it until it loads the music data, so nothing spawns at runtime. So I wrote my own and it mostly works. The biggest issue was stopping them spawning on the path, especially during turns and when turning back on itself. I used a bit of a fudge and did distance checking with the spline, and deleted any buildings that are too close or overlap. It doesn't work 100% of the time, but it cleans it up for the most part. Spawning enemies on the beat is currently something in the game that I'm very unhappy with because I don't think it works correctly. It works by sampling a frequency from the get spectrum data method of the audio source. Once that frequency hits a certain value, an enemy spawns. But I also set a limit on how many enemies can be active, so new enemies won't spawn until the old ones are dead or despawned. The problem with this method is that I have to manually set where on the spectrum it's sampling data. But with every song being different, the chosen sample might not be the best for spawning enemies. This is certainly something I would like to change if I ever touch this project again, but I'll get back to that in a bit. One last thing on enemies, they have a basic ragdoll attached to them which gets activated when they get shot. The gun is pretty simple, it's a child object of the right hand, so it just follows you around as you move. There are some basic particle effects for the muzzle flash and bullet casings. The shooting is a bit odd. The input gets turned into a boolean which I send to the gun's animation controller. As long as the gun has bullets, the shooting animation will then play. When the amount of bullets left is 1, instead of the normal firing animation, it will play one when the slide locks back. Simultaneously, an empty magazine is spawned. This brings me on to reloading, which is inspired by Half-Life Alyx. I do a dot product check on the player's left hand. If it goes behind the player's head and they press the grip button, a full magazine will spawn in their hand. Then the player can just slap the full mag to the grip of the gun where the trigger collider is, and press the slide release button to get back to shooting. It's not as fancy as Alex's animations, but it works. A small drawback to the animation-driven shooting is that it feels a bit latent, or rather it seems to hang when you try and rapid fire. I suspect the shooting animation may be too long, or perhaps I need to try a different approach. Music loading was the last thing I implemented before the deadline, as you can probably tell by the lack of MP3 file support. Unity only lets you load in .ogg and .wav files at runtime, unless you're willing to do some additional work. Loading them was a bit troublesome. Creating a directory for the player to put their music in was simple enough, but I had to use the outdated www class to load it. I've never done anything like this before, so it took a bit of trial and error to get working, but once I did get it working, I was happy enough. Or I would have been if it wasn't for the game crashing whenever I tried to load a level in the executable, which has nothing to do with my code, but something to do with the compilers Unity uses when making builds. But I switched it back to mono and then it worked fine. But I did spend a whole day trying to figure out what the problem was. That's all I have to say in regards to implementation. There's not much I'm actually happy with. The ragdolls are hilarious. They're not accurate, but they are funny. But the important thing I am pleased with is avoiding triggering my motion sickness while the player is moving. VR movement is a real point of contention for me. Games that don't support teleport and rely on the player-controlled movement often make me motion sick, and there's a ton of games I literally can't play because of it. But being on rails seems to work in this case. I'm not sure if it's because of how slowly I made the player move, or due to the focus on the combat instead of the movement. I think further testing is going to be required. Now on to things that suck and I would like to improve or fix. The building overlapping the player's path is really annoying. The distance checking fix I have for it only really clears up maybe 80% of it, but when the path has a lot of corners it starts causing problems. An alternate solution I thought about but lacked the time to implement was building a bounds around the spline and despawning them if they're inside. Likewise, it would make spawning enemies easier as I could spawn them inside bounds. So, buildings outside and enemies inside. Enemy spawning is a bit of a mess at the minute. As you may have noticed in the video footage, enemies sometimes spawn and then despawn. This is what happens when they're intersecting with a building. I was having issues where enemies were spawning inside of buildings, so I wrote a bit of code that just deletes them if they're colliding with them. It's not a great solution, but it does solve the problem. MP3 support, along with other formats, is also something I would like to get in. A Twitch user by the name of Jason Story actually gave me some code related to the library N-Audio for use in Unity. I'll take a look at that and see what I can do with it, but no promises. Getting back to the way enemies spawned on beat, my current method is problematic as it more or less treats every song as if it was the same, but some songs are slower, quieter, etc. And adjustments need to be made to accommodate for that. But I can't do that because of the real-time nature of the system I have. An alternative needs to be made, preferably something that calculates all this data before the level is loaded. If you've ever played Audio Surf, you'll notice that when you load up a song, it spends a second or two processing it. I think I would need to implement a similar system. The last thing probably worth noting is that there's no difficulty or challenge to the game. You can't die, there's no point to shooting the enemies, and there's no real goal. Even if it is a proof of concept, it really should have a point to it, otherwise it's not as much fun as it could be. And maybe an actual art style would be nice. Superhot is a great game and all, but I wasn't intending to mimic their art style. Despite the problems and things I really wish I had the time to change and fix, it is a better game than the zombie shooter I made last year. That thing was terrible. My overall opinion on VR development is a bit mixed. It's fairly easy to get set up in Unity, but I also spent a good amount of that time jerry-rigging everything. It feels like it shouldn't work, but it does. Jumping in and out of VR to test the game was also physically taxing on me, and my body has only just recovered from it. As for other things I want to test in VR, I want to explore more of the on-rails aspect. I might create a small multi-story level and test things like navigating through the level, stopping and starting, going upstairs, and other things. I also want to see what will happen if you put the player in a moving turret, like on top of a truck or in a helicopter. Although I have no idea when I'll have the time to make such a thing. I wouldn't expect anything related to VR from me anytime soon. Maybe next 7-day FPS. Let's end with some updates on some other things. Before I started on the 7-day FPS game, I made some changes to Cyber Surfer. I can finally make tracks using the spline tool. I want to give a shout out to Game Dev Guide for his video on building tracks using the spline tool. I'll leave a link in the description. The benefits of this change is that I no longer have to hop between Unity and Blender every time I want to make a change to the track, and setting up colliders along the sides is much easier as I can just generate them along the spline. That said, it is a bit flat, in the horizontal axis I mean. It would be nice if I had curved corners and maybe even some half pipe or full pipe style track sections. I'll see what I can do. Last 7-day FPS, my friend and I made a bunch of shotguns for the zombie game, and soon after I cleaned them up and sold them as standalone assets. I'm likely going to do the same for the handgun in this year's game. I'm not sure when it'll be available, so keep an eye on my itch.io page in the following weeks and months. Also, I should note that those shotguns are likely still on sale from the extra sale I ran on my itch page, unless you're seeing this past the 8th of January, in which case tough luck. Also, shoutouts to my friend Craig, who made those shotguns and also made the handgun this year. Global Game Jam is coming up in late January, early February, and due to the arrangement I have with my friend, we will be using Godot for it. So that's my plan for the next month, learning Godot or at least getting a bit better with it. I'm also planning out an update for my stream layout, and I'll try and fit in some more Cyber Surfer development where I can. And for my last update, I upgraded my PC. I switched out my Ryzen 7 2700 for a Ryzen 7 5800X 3D, and my GTX 1070 for an RTX 3060. I'm quite happy with the performance boost, and productivity has increased too. Unity loads in under 30 seconds, and Blender performance is considerably improved. That said, I went a bit over budget because one of my hard drives had a meltdown and I lost all the media that was on it, including the videos uploaded to this channel. So I took the opportunity to swap out that drive and the remaining hard drives with solid state drives, and get an additional NVMe SSD for more modern games, seeing as I have the juice to play them now. Even with Black Friday deals, it still cost me more than I'm comfortable with. And that's everything. There's links in the description for my Twitch channel, my itch.io page, and you can even throw me a few bob on Ko-fi if you're so inclined. And I'll see you next video, whenever that is.